that, but we don't need all that detail to look at number 9. So it says, Mamzer posel umachil. Mamzer, a person who's a mamzer, can disqualify people from eating sacred food and entitle them to eat sacred food. Okay? And now we give examples. Ketzad, how? Bat Yisrael lechohen. If a Yisraelite woman marries a Kohen, she marries a Kohen. Uvat Kohen liYisrael. Or the daughter of a Kohen marries a Yisrael. Either direction. V'yalda himenu bat. And she gives birth to a son from him. From either of these unions. I'm sorry, a daughter. Thank you, you're right. She gives birth to a daughter. V'halcha habat. Now this is a Jewish daughter now. Because this was perfectly legal marriages. Right? And the offspring of this marriage was a daughter. V'halcha habat v'niseit le'eved or legoy. And this daughter was perfectly Jewish. Went and married either a slave, that means a non-Jewish slave, or a non-Jewish man. V'yalda himenu ben, and they have a son. Harei ze mamzer. That son is a mamzer. That son is a mamzer. Now, no one can leave now. Right? Not that you were planning it. But be careful. Please do not say that that's the law. All right? But this Mishnah, which is also without any dispute, without any argument, probably from the same era, claims that the offspring of a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman is a mamzer. Here's my question. Is a mamzer Jewish or not?
If it is mamzer, it's Jewish.
Yeah.
That's right. Non-Jews are not mamzerim. At least not in the technical sense. Whether a non-Jew would be a colloquial mamzer is a different question. But in the technical sense, it's impossible. All right? So please note that this too is the matrilineal principle. But this Mishnah is exceptionally strict and claims that in such a case, the child is pagum. He's a mamzer. He's a mamzer. These sources, these Mishnayot, are the clearest, most unambiguous sources one could ever look for that stipulate the matrilineal principle in each direction. With the exception of one more passage that we will read in a bit, I cannot find, and people who have studied a lot more of this, studied it a lot more thoroughly than I, nobody can find a Jewish source from the middle of the 1st century on, except for one that we'll read in a minute, that questions the legal status of these of the Mishnah. That is, it seems absolutely clear from about the middle of the 1st century, give or take 50 years, there's only one standard in Jewish tradition. And that standard is the opposite of the standard I told you from the Bible. The Bible, I said, is clearly patrilineal. And from the middle of the 1st century, it looks like the standard is that the rabbinic tradition is matrilineal. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I'm not giving you a Gemara class today. My goal is not to teach Talmud to you, okay? But passage number 10 is the the Talmudic source that tries to give the verses that prove the things that we're talking about. Yes?
Why the Gemara says Ubas Israel Lekoinu Ubas Kohen Israel? What does it say straight Israel and Israel or something like that?
Because it means even if it's a Bat Israel, or even if it's Kohanim. And then Halakha Shkama B'chama if it's not Kohanim. Okay. Passage number 10, I will read with you. Part of it I'm not even going to try to explain to you because it would take us too long, and the part I really want to get to, I want to get to. All right? But here's what passage number 10 says. It's from the Talmud on the Mishnah, which is passage number 8. All right? So the Talmud says, Vladak Motaminalan, from where do we know that the offspring of the non-Jewish woman is like her, the slave lady? There were two listed in the Mishnah, a handmaiden, a slave, and a non-Jewish woman. So the Gemara says, where do we know that the offspring of a non-Jewish slave is like her, is like a slave? The Amar Krav, the Torah says in Exodus and Mishpatim, Ha'isha v'ladea ti'aladoneha. If I own a non-Jewish slave lady and I beget children with her, those children become permanent slaves. They become permanent slaves. And so that means that they have the mother status. Since I didn't worry about the slaves, don't worry about that one. Nachrit minala, from where do we know that the offspring of a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman is non-Jewish? Amar Kra, in the book of Deuteronomy, Lo titchatein bam. You shouldn't marry into them. You shouldn't intermarry with them. So the Gemara says, Ashkechanna de la tafse ba'kiddushe. That verse only proves to us that you're not allowed to marry them. But how do I know that if I do marry them, the offspring are non-Jewish? All it tells me is don't marry them. Okay? But it doesn't tell me for sure that the offspring are non-Jewish. So I'm a Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Damar Krav, the verse says, Ki yasiret bincha me'acharai. For he will move your son away from me, from following me. That's God talking. God talking. One of the reasons you shouldn't intermarry is because from the consequence of intermarriage, your children might be moved away from the service of God. So then the Gemara says, Bincha haba Yisraelit karui bincha. Your son who comes from a Jewish woman is called your son. Ve'ein bincha haba min ha'ovedet kochavim karui bincha el bana. But your son who comes from a non-Jewish woman is not called your son, but her son. Now listen, everyone. Rashi and Tosafot on that page have this big argument about how this proves it. You understand what I'm saying? And I don't want to spend time on that. But it is clear to the Babylonian Talmud that this verse is being quoted as some type of a hook to hang on which to hang the idea that you have matrilineal descent and that the offspring of a non-Jewish woman will be non-Jewish. If anybody who ever studied Gemara with me heard me say this, they wouldn't believe it. Don't worry about how it does it. Right? Believe me, when I teach a Gemara class, I never say don't worry about how it pulls it off. All right? But for what we're doing today, the only thing that's relevant is that the Gemara is here quoting the verse that it thinks proves this. I add one little PS to this. The very fact that it is entirely unclear how this verse really proves this is another indication that a real biblical source for matrilineal descent is very hard to find. Right? If there were really a clear source for matrilineal descent, I wouldn't have to have an argument between Rashi and Tosafot of how you prove it. Okay? Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this passage to you, but please take my word for it that by the end of this passage, Ravina who is classically considered one of the editors of the Babylonian Talmud. So let's say he's in the 6th century, but he's still of the period of the Talmud. Ravina undoes the second Mishnah we read and says, if the offspring, if a child is born to a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman, the child is Jewish and not a mamzer. He says he ain't perfect, but he's not a mamzer. He's not perfect, but he's not a mamzer. So he undoes the mamzer part if it was a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman. But that doesn't happen till 300 or 350 years after the Mishnah, which called him a mamzer. Okay, now, wait. Number one, I'm going to stand up. That's going to make difficulty following me, so maybe I'll try to stand right here. All right, so here we go. That then leads me backwards to the following question. Can we find any clues prior to these Mishnahs about matrilineal descent, or can we not? So, I want to tell you what people have said. I'm not going to read them with you. They're there in English. If you want, you can try. If you don't want, you don't have to try. But Philo and the New Testament, know nothing about the matrilineal principle. They have absolutely no clue about this, about matrilineal. All right? And Philo and the New Testament are prior to the era in which I'm talking about. I mean, remember, when Jesus lives, there's still a temple standing. All right? So, Philo doesn't know about it, and the New Testament doesn't know about it. Period. Yes?
But Roth or Grimm, they say that the New Testament was written over the 2nd century, or at least the last 10 or 20 years of the 1st century. So almost the same period of Yavne.
Correct. Which might mean either that it was very new, right, and not yet ingrained. That's probably what it means. All right. What is it that some people think did happen? Some people think that it was Ezra who introduced the matrilineal principle. Now, when is Ezra? The first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. Okay? About 70 years later, 75 years later, Darius allows Ezra to go back to Israel with a group and rebuild the temple. So let's say around the year 500 BCE. That's a long time before the middle of the 1st century CE. Right? 500 BCE is 550 years before the time that I said it's clear that we have the matrilineal principle. Look at passage number 4. This is a passage from the book of Ezra, and this is a passage that many people quote. This is a passage that many people quote as their type of evidence that Ezra introduced the matrilineal principle. By the way, if it's true, I would have one very difficult time figuring out why the New Testament and Philo and Josephus don't know anything about the matrilineal principle. Because Ezra is hundreds of years before them. All right? So here's what Ezra says. Uchalot ela nigshu ela hasarim lemor. Don't worry about it. When these were done, the machers came to me. Nigshu ela hasarim, the leaders of the people, lemor, saying, Lo nivdalu ha'am Yisrael v'kohanim v'alevim me'ameh ha'aratzot. The people of Israel did not separate the Kohanim and the Leviim did not separate themselves from the Amei Ha'aratzot. This is not the modern colloquial meaning of Amei Ha'aratzot. This means the people, the local people. Okay? It doesn't mean ignoramuses. It means the people, the non-Jewish people. Ketoavotehem lakanani, hachiti, haprizi, ha'ivusi, ha'amoni, ha'moavi, ha'mitzri, ha'amori. They didn't separate themselves from these abominable people that belong to all of these nations. Ki nasa'u b'nei benotehem lahem. They married some of their daughters, right? They married the daughters of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizi. That means it could be a non-Jewish mother, okay? They married them, Vilibnehem, and they married off their children to them. Vehit arvu zera hakodesh ba'amei ha'aratzot, and the holy seed, that is to say, us Jews, got mixed with these nations. And the machers of the community, this is a free translation, and the machers of the community were the primary offenders. Right? I can give you a literal translation, but that's what it means. Right? And the princes and their assistants, they were first in this transgression. That means the big name people, they were number one to violate this and marry them. Skip two lines. I don't need, Ezra does a little praying then. I mean, I'm not knocking praying, but it's not so critical to what I want to read this for. You see the little bet in parenthesis, that's where I'm going to read now. Vayam Shechania ben Yechiel mibnei Elam vayomer le'Ezra. This guy, his name is Shechania ben Yechiel, from the children of Elam, he said to Ezra, Anachnu ma'alnu belohenu. We have sinned against our God. V'noshev nashim nochriot me'amei ha'aretz. And we have taken foreign wives from these foreign nations. V'ata yesh mikvel Yisrael azot. But there is a hope, there's a solution. V'ata nichrot brit le'Elohenu lehotzi kol nashim. Let's make a covenant with God to send away all these women, v'hanolad mehem, and all the children born to them. So this Shechania recommends to Ezra that what we should do is in fact kick out all these wives and their children. Well, who were the wives they were talking about? They were talking about the wives from all these foreign nations. So many argue that this may have been the beginning of the matrilineal principle. That Ezra says, the book of Ezra, they kicked out all these foreign wives. I point out two things to you. Number one, that would only account for half of the matrilineal principle. It wouldn't account for the other half. That's number one. And number two, what makes it not so likely is that if it really began around the year 500 BCE, while it's theoretically possible that we could go until the 1st century CE without seeing any traces of it, it is not so probable. So point number one, everybody. I cannot tell you with any certainty, I wouldn't say that. I cannot tell you with absolute certainty when the adoption of the matrilineal principle is. My guess is that it's in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, approximately, around the time of Yahweh. And now I ask the next question. What would have made Jewish tradition switch from the patrilineal principle to the matrilineal principle? Several theories have been proposed. Let me share with you a couple of those theories. One theory was that we switched because maternity is certain and paternity is not. Right? Until the days of DNA, that was clearly the case. Maternity is certain, paternity is not. Well, the reason I can't buy that argument is that that was true in the days of Moses, and that was true in the days of Joseph, and that was true in the days of David, and that was true in the days of Solomon. And if that was the reason, then then I have no clue as to why in the Bible it was patrilineal. If the reason for matrilineal is to be certain who the mother is, right? Because after all, the kid came out of her, right? Excuse the bluntness of that. That's how it worked. But that's the way it worked in the Bible too. If it didn't work that way in the Bible, don't tell me, right? And my guess is that it worked that way in the Bible too. So that theory doesn't appeal to me. One theory that used to have a lot of people who liked it was to say that the theory took place around the Roman period, around the time when the Romans were destroying the temple. When were the Romans destroying the temple? In the middle of the 1st century. And why did it take place then? It was to assuage, to make feel less bad, the feelings of the families of the Jewish girls who were raped by Roman soldiers and had babies. This used to be a very popular theory. But this theory could only have been proposed by those who never read the second Mishnah that I read with you. Because in that second Mishnah that I read with you, offspring of those children, offspring of those unions were called the mamzer. There is no way that it comforts a family whose daughter has been raped to say, oh, don't panic. Your kids will be Jewish. They'll just be a mamzer. Mamzer is uncorrectable. You cannot undo a mamzer. It would be better to say your kid will be a goy, because by that time there is already conversion. One second. So it would be better to say your children will be non-Jews, because at least that way I can convert them. Shall I ask now then, because I'm about to give you two theories of current theories.
Mamzer, ממזרת, אבל Israel.
No. If a mamzer's children are mamzerim forever. A mamzer's children are mamzerim forever.
If they get married with another mamzer.
Well, even if they don't marry another mamzer. That's one of those earlier statements in the Mishnah. If you marry Havla Pagum, and the mamzer will always be the Pagum one. Right? So what I'm trying to tell you all is mamzerut is uncorrectable. Uncorrectable. So I do not think that it is so likely that that was the reason. A friend of mine who was an historian of the Rabbinic period and a good scholar, used to be at the Jewish Theological Seminary, then he went to Harvard, Shia Cohen, wrote a book called The Origins of Jewishness. I think that's the exact title. The Origins of Jewishness. That's a book that I still hardly recommend to people if they wish to read it, and to see a bunch of little sources that I didn't quote to you and things like that Shia Cohen does quote. He offers two other theories for the institution of the matrilineal principle among Jews. One theory is that at around the time that we're talking about, the middle of the 1st century, there was instituted in Rome the idea that full citizenship could come only when a citizen married a citizen. The idea that the offspring, the children of a marriage, are full Roman citizens only when the father and the mother are citizens. And that if the father and the mother are not citizens, if either the father or the mother is not a citizen, then there is some imperfection in the citizenship of the children. And he quotes things very parallel to what we read in the first mission. Very parallel. His other theory is that maybe this wasn't something that we borrowed from the Romans, but it was something that was unique, that was inherently Jewish. You know, Jews are not allowed to mix all sorts of things. You can't mix seeds when you plant them in the ground. That's called kilayim. You're not allowed to do that. You can't plant seeds of two different things in the same place. You can't mate animals that are different species. And mules in Jewish tradition are a big problem, because no one knows what to call them. Because we have this aversion to mixing different species. So the view that Shai Cohen himself thinks is the most plausible is either the Roman law one or this Jewish aversion to the mixing of things that shouldn't mix. And since it is clear to all of us that we're opposed to intermarriage, that means Jews and non-Jews shouldn't mix. So when we mix Jews and non-Jews, we have to have some decision of what do we do. So we said, we follow the mother. And that, he says, he thinks, was the institution of the matrilineal principle. In his book, The Origins of Jewishness, Shai Cohen is not at all interested in the determination of Jewish law. Once, has to be a long time ago, I don't remember exactly when it was, it has to be the mid-80s probably, or even maybe a little bit earlier, 81, 82, there used to be a journal that was published quarterly, at least in theory, called Judaism. That was the name of the journal. And one issue of that was devoted to the patrilineal business, and Shai Cohen wrote an article called The Matrilineal Principle in Historical Perspective. Okay? You will have a hard time finding this, although maybe you have Judaism up in your library. You do. I don't remember exactly what year this was, but Shai Cohen wrote the article. But in this article, allow me to read you the last sentence. In its interpretation of the Constitution, that's the Constitution of the United States, the Supreme Court considers, but is not bound by the original meaning of the document in its 18th century context. In the earlier session today that I gave an example of that. Here's his last sentence. The jurist seeks to determine the law. Right? The lawyer, the judge, they determine the law. The historian seeks to determine the truth. The two need not coincide. I now begin to discuss with you the second half of what I wanted to deal with you. And when I finish discussing this, I'm going to open the floor for you to yell at me, not yell at me, ask, whatever it is that you want to do. So here we are, everybody. Joel Roth, the most right-wing conservative rabbi that exists. Just ask anybody in the seminary, who's the most right-wing guy in the conservative movement? They will say, Joel Roth. I cannot resist telling you that this idea is so astounding to me that I pass out every time anybody says this. This most right-wing guy is the one who brought about the ordination of women. How right-winged could he have been that he's the one who was the architect of the ordination of women? It's simple. The people who were to his right abandoned the movement after that. So what used to be the center is now the right. We still have a bell curve. Only Roth is not in the middle of it anymore. He's way over and it used to be the middle. My teachers, when we did the ordination of women, said, I'm in bed with the wrong people. That is, the Talmudists, the Halachists, they all disagreed with it. Right? Anyway, period. So here, I said to you, me, the right-winger, right? It's pretty clear to me that the Bible is patrilineal.
Sorry?
Absolutely. It is clear to me that the Bible is patrilineal. And the question is, the point is that there is tremendous pressure that exists to this very day. And it's not getting less, it's getting more. For the conservative movement, after all, as I said in an earlier session, we believe in the evolutionary theory of Jewish law. Jewish law does not have to be the same today as it was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And with the increased rate of intermarriage, maybe we should reconsider and adopt or readopt the patrilineal principle. After all, if I'm right, we at least have a biblical precedent for it. We don't have a very good, I forgot to read one source with you. Oh, I better read it because I won't sleep if I don't look at it with you. I won't sleep again, so look at it for 1 minute. It is source number 11.